Well, thank you so much, Senator Lincoln. That was the nicest introduction I've ever had, I'd say. And Senator Byrd would appreciate you quoting Cicero. And I also want to thank the Butler Center for inviting me, and particularly David Strickland, an old friend for the Oral History Connections, who has worked this out, and everything has just gone so smoothly. I'd like to thank Senator Pryor as well for being here. And I especially like to thank Betsey Wright for providing the opportunity to do this. It's a real honor to be here and giving a lecture in your name. See if I can get this to work. By the way, the artist who painted the painting that's on the far right is sitting here as well. So this is Hattie Caraway, but this is the picture I wanted to start with. And that is, take a good look at this picture. Really take a look at this picture. This is the first official photograph taken of the United States Senate in session on September 24th, 1963, the day they were going to vote on the nuclear test ban treaty. The Capitol Historical Society arranged for this photograph to be taken for their souvenir book called We the People. And perhaps the Senate agreed to schedule it on this day because they knew so many senators were going to be there for this important vote. Or perhaps they scheduled it for this day to make sure that so many senators were going to be there for this particular vote. By the way, it took the senators about 10 more years to realize they could turn around and face the camera when this picture was taken. We still do this at every Congress. In many respects, this picture from 1963 looks exactly the way the Senate does today if you were looking at it on C-SPAN. It's the same 100 mahogany desks arranged in the same semicircular rows with the same snuff boxes and spittoons that have been there since the 19th century. If you're watching C-SPAN, you would see something like this, except, of course, you wouldn't see very many of the senators in their desks at any particular time. This is a rare occasion when everybody is there. This picture was also taken before there were television lights. Nowadays, the Senate is sort of a high noon, it's so bright. In those days, the Senate was twilight because they didn't need the bright lights. But for this picture, they had arranged for the photographer to set up a huge barrier of flashlights that go off to be able to get it bright enough. You may notice there's a copy of the New York Times on the floor underneath Barry Goldwater's desk. It was against the rules back then and still is against the rules to read a newspaper in the Senate chamber, just like it's against the rules to look at an electronic device in the Senate chamber, except, of course, if you look carefully, you may see a number of senators underneath their desks very surreptitiously texting. Of course, there were no cell phones and computers in those days. The Senate was a very traditional institution. But most dramatically, this picture was taken half a century ago, and it shows practically no women at all. If you look way over on the right side of the picture, you may spot Margaret Chase Smith, a Republican senator from Maine. And if you look way over on the other side, you may spot Maureen Neuberger of Oregon. So those two, the Democrat and Republican, were the only two women senators at the time. And if you look at that front desk, you'll notice that everybody up there is a gray-haired man, including, by the way, the then parliamentarian of the Senate, whose name was Charles Watkins, who was from Mount Ida, Arkansas. When that picture was taken of the Senate in 1963, Watkins was 84 years old. He had been in the Senate for 58 years. He still had a remarkable memory for precedents and didn't have a computer to remind him the way that the modern parliamentarians do these days. And again, if you looked up at the press gallery, looking down on the Senate, you would see practically no women in those pictures. The Senate has come a long way since then. These days, sometimes if you're in the chamber and you're looking at the staff at the front desk, all of them are women. Sometimes the presiding officer is a woman, usually a junior senator presiding in lieu of the vice president or president pro tempore. And if you look up at the press gallery, about half of the reporters in the gallery today are women. And down on the floor, 21 of the 100 senators are now women. And that's the highest number that it has ever been. It was in 1932 when Arkansas became the first state to elect a woman to the United States Senate. I don't want to imply tonight, however, that Hattie Caraway is the first woman to have anything to do with the United States Senate. In fact of the matter is, women have made a very long contribution to the history of the Senate. I'm going to be going backwards in time and then coming up to the present to look at the Senate both before and after Hattie Caraway. In the 19th century, women lacked the right to vote, and they lacked the right to serve in office. But that didn't mean they weren't interested in what was going on in politics. And in fact, the galleries were so crowded with women who came to watch what was going on that when the current Senate chamber was opened in 1859, one of the galleries was set aside as a ladies' gallery. And in fact, if you walk around the Senate today, if you look up there, it's still painted over the door. But we no longer separate our senators by gender, or spectators by gender, the way they did in the 19th century. The women came to watch what was going on because they were interested in what was happening. And they commented on what was going on. One of the first to write regularly about what was going on in the Senate was Margaret Bayard Smith. Her husband published the major newspaper in Washington at the time, and that was the National Intelligencer. And she wrote letters about what she saw. Now, she wrote these as private letters, but we historians use these letters to find out what was going on. She was there, for instance, when Massachusetts Senator Daniel Webster had his famous debate with South Carolina Senator Robert Hayne. It was about the spread of slavery into the territories. And on the day that Senator Webster famously replied to Hayne, observers counted 150 women in the gallery of the Senate watching this. That's about half of the seats that were available. Margaret Bayard Smith wrote that no debate on a purely political principle would have attracted such a throng. But she said personalities are irresistible. It is a kind of more than a gladiatorship. Never were amphitheaters of Rome more crowded with the highest ranks of both sexes. She wrote for private consumption. But very soon there were women reporters as well. And this is Jane Grace Swisselle, who was the first woman to sit in the Senate press gallery as a reporter. She sat there in 1850. She published a small newspaper in Pittsburgh. It was an abolitionist newspaper. And she wanted to get down to Washington because the issues were so important. She said, the danger was imminent, the crisis alarming, and the excitement very great. I longed to be in Washington. Boldly, she went up to see Horace Greeley, the famous editor of the New York Tribune, and she offered herself as a correspondent for Greeley's newspaper. Now, Greeley was a supporter of women's rights, and he thought it was a real novelty to have a woman as a reporter. He hired her, and he paid her $5 for every letter that she sent from the gallery. Now, she declined to sit in the public gallery with the other women. She wanted to sit in the press gallery, which was just above the presiding officer. So she went to see the Vice President of the United States, who in those days was in charge of letting women into the press gallery, and that was Millard Fillmore. And she said she wanted to be there, and he told her that the place would be very unpleasant for a lady, that she would attract attention, and that she would not like it. But she persisted, and he relented. And so Jane Swisselle sat in the press gallery. She was there on the day that a senator from Mississippi pulled a pistol on a senator from Missouri. We think politics has gotten rough these days. She said, I sat in the reporter's gallery directly opposite those gentlemen, and I saw it all, she wrote to her readers. Unfortunately, Jane Swisselle did not last very long, a very short time in the press gallery, because she gathered information while she was there to write an expose of Senator Webster's questionable private life. And she believed that Webster had sold out, essentially, on the slavery issue, and she wanted to prevent him from being nominated for president. Other reporters in the gallery knew that what she wrote was actually true, but in those days they disdained from writing about the private lives of public men. And she did not send that article to Greeley, because Greeley was supporting Webster for president. She said she published it in her own newspaper, but it was reprinted in so many newspapers across the country that embarrassed Greeley, and he fired her after a very short period in the gallery. That didn't mean that women reporters stopped coming. In fact, women reporters came in even greater numbers, and they tended not to be able to write political news. The men who hired them didn't think that they were up to writing about real rough and tumble politics. But they thought, well, they knew the social side of Washington. They could write pen and portrait sketches. And actually, a number of women became quite prominent and quite wealthy, writing these sort of personal sketches of Washington. Emily Edson Briggs wrote under the pen name of Olivia. She was the wife of a Senate clerk. She had a skill for capturing things very quickly and describing senators and others, and sort of an apt way of describing things. She commented, for instance, on the great number of women, particularly cabinet wives and senators' wives, who were in the galleries. She observed that the carriages bring the cream and the streetcars bring the skimmed milk. In 1880, there were 20 women, including Emily Briggs, in the press gallery. But that year, the gallery adopted new rules designed to get rid of lobbyists. Lobbyists were masquerading as journalists. And so the new rules said that if you wanted to be a legitimate reporter and come into the press gallery, you had to report for a daily newspaper by telegraph. That seemed fair enough. And it eliminated all of the lobbyists, but it also eliminated all 20 women who had been sitting in the gallery prior, because, again, they were not writing the hard political news that justified telegraph tolls. They were mailing. They were correspondents, essentially. And so all of them were gone. There were no women of any appreciable number in the press gallery again until the Second World War, when so many men went overseas as war correspondents or as combatants. There was also a group of women lobbyists at the Capitol in the 19th century. Mark Twain was a reporter for 1 year in Washington, and as the result of that, he wrote a novel called The Gilded Age, which gave its name to that time period. The novel is quite wonderful. It's based on the real senators of the time. But one of the characters in the novel, which was very popular in the book and in the stage play that was produced right after that, was a sort of wily female lobbyist named Laura Hawkins. Now, the senators he was writing about were definitely based on real senators. But I think Laura Hawkins came out of his imagination, because all of the newspaper accounts of what women lobbyists were like at the time said that they really were not lobbying for issues. They were lobbying for private claims. They were women whose spouses had been injured during the Civil War or whose property had been destroyed. They were trying to get some kind of reimbursement. And in 1891, the Washington Star said, instead of the glamorous and professional lobbyists of fiction, that the real women lobbyists were more likely to be, quote, poorly clad, nervous, wistful, and frightened women with some claim before Congress. Now, this is a magazine article, illustration that appeared about the same time. I would not say that this is a poorly clad and nervous woman in any way. She's obviously quite determined to get her point across, and she has trapped a senator into a window well that's still there, using her umbrella sort of as a way of keeping him from getting away from her argument. Regarding the staff of Congress, the 19th century, it was essentially a male domain. One of the few exceptions was a woman named Kate Brown, an African-American who had charge of the ladies' retiring room, which was essentially the ladies' restroom of the Senate. And although senators described her as refined, we know about her mostly from an incident that took place in 1868 in which she rebelled. Kate Brown had taken the train to Alexandria, Virginia from Washington. But when she tried to return, one of the rail line's private police officers stopped her. She said, "The policeman ran up and told me I could not ride in the car. He said that car was for ladies." He meant white ladies. Brown responded, "I bought my ticket to go to Washington in this car. Before I leave this car, I will suffer death." The officer physically threw her off the train and then dragged her along the platform. A Senate committee clerk came running up and rescued her at this time, but she was quite badly injured when she was taken back to Washington to get medical treatment. Upon hearing about this incident, Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner demanded that the Senate investigate what he called an outrage that has occurred within sight of the Capitol. So a Senate committee later that month heard testimony from railroad officials and from Kate Brown's doctor. She gave her testimony from a sickbed. The Senate committee issued a report favorable to Brown, and with Senator Sumner's encouragement, Kate Brown sued the railroad company. Now, legal arguments focused on the company's right to segregate its cars. At that time, racial segregation was just becoming common on railroads. But in this particular case, it was illegal. because in 1863, the Congress had charted this line, authorizing the Washington and Alexandria Railroad, and it insisted, at Senator Sumner's insistence, that there was a key phrase in there that no person shall be excluded from the cars on account of color. Railroad officials argued that they had complied by providing a separate car, but the courts of the District of Columbia sided with Brown and awarded her $1,500. The railroad company appealed. The case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, which confirmed that the 1863 law charter remained in force, and Kate Brown won her case and remained as a Senate employee until 1881. So if we flash forward a century ahead, segregation was never the law in Washington, D.C., but it was the widespread custom, even in the U.S. Capitol. In the Senate restaurant, most of the employees were African American, but all of the customers were white. And in the 1930s, the Senate had hired its first black clerk and for a committee. But he was significantly high enough in status to have a parking place. So he drove home for lunch every day. In 1953, the first African American secretary was hired. This is Christine McCreary, who was hired by Senator Stuart Symington in Missouri to work in his office. She came by trolley. There was no place for her to eat on Capitol Hill. She asked the senator where she should go. He sent her to the Senate restaurant, which was then in the Russell Senate office building. And I did an oral history with her in 1998, and she recalled that when she got there, the matron at the door said that the restaurant was only accessible to Senate staff. And she said, well, I'm Senate staff. And the person said, well, okay, come in, have a seat. Well, she said everybody was stopped and looking, and it was a big to-do. She had to go through a cafeteria line to get her food, and one of the kitchen staff was so nervous that she shoved the plate at her, and it shot past her, and it broke on the floor, scattered all over. I asked her what she did, and she said, I stepped back because I didn't want to get it on my clothes, and it all went on the floor. She said, well, they were all looking at me, but I had to deal with it. So anyway, I got another plate. And then I went back the next day, and the next day. And finally, they got used to seeing me coming in there, and there was no more problem after that. And that was how the Senate cafeterias were integrated in 1963. The Senate Historical Office does an oral history program. If you go to our website, you can hear Christine McCreary telling that particular story. By the early 20th century, the Senate staff had begun to grow, and women were hired in different posts. And in 1901, a woman named Leona Wells was hired, and she became a clerk to a committee. It was so unusual that newspapers ran stories about the fact that she was the highest paid woman in Washington in the government. She became the clerk to the Appropriations Committee, which is one of the most powerful of all committees. And it was quite impressive that she had this position. She broke a lot of barriers, but not all barriers were lowered for her. There were some that remained, one of which was the door to the Senate chamber. Every other Senate clerk, meaning men, could go into the Senate and assist their senators, the chairman of the committee, on the floor. She was not allowed on the floor. She had to stand outside the door and keep the door ajar just enough to hear what was going on so she could send in messages to assist her chairman. But it was against the rules for women staffers to be on the floor. There are other members. I could give an entire speech just on the spouses of senators. And spouses have played an enormous role. There's a lot of senators who would never have gotten into the U.S. Senate except for their spouses. And there are a lot of spouses who suffered considerably about the arduous journeys that it used to take to get to Washington in the 19th century. And then also having to split your year, essentially living half in the capital and half back in the home state, raising families and doing all the things that was expected of them. Interestingly enough, a number of spouses in the days before nepotism was also worked in their senators' offices and their spouses' offices. So Harry Truman hired Bess Truman to work as a secretary in his office. It helped the family income, and she was in Washington at the exact same time as he was in Washington, and that was not uncommon. Now, Mrs. Hattie Caraway was not on staff of the Senate, and she was never officially a member of her husband's staff. But like many other Senate spouses, she worked on all of his campaigns, And newspapers at the time noted that that she became an advisor to the senator on all important questions. So she knew politics and she knew government, even though she tried to stay in the background and raise their children. Hattie Wyatt Caraway was not the first woman senator. That distinction went to Rebecca Lattimore Felton from Georgia. A Georgia senator had died unexpectedly in 1922, and the governor appointed Mrs. Felton to fill the vacancy. Women had just gotten the right to vote in 1920, and the governor thought, well, this would be a nice gesture on his part, and maybe women voters would treat him well at the polls the next time because he was appointing her. And he figured that it was just a symbolic gesture because the Senate was out of session at the time. They were going to hold a special election to bring in her successor. By the time the Senate came back into session, some man would have been elected to fill the position. He did not count on Rebecca Felton because in December of that year, she showed up in Washington and demanded to be seated. And so the Senate had a debate on this, because technically they should have seated the senator who just got elected. But there was such a clamor from women's suffrage leaders to have a woman in the Senate that the men relented and decided that they would let Mrs. Felton take her seat for one day. And she stood up, thanked the gentleman for giving the lady a seat, and said to them, she gave a really stirring speech, that when the women of this country come in and sit with you, though there may be few in the next few years, I pledge that you will get ability, you will get integrity of purpose, you will get exalted patriotism, and you will get unstinted usefulness. There were women suffragists packing the gallery who cheered that particular speech, but that was her sole day as a woman senator. And then, in 1931, Arkansas Senator Hattie Caraway died very unexpectedly. If he had died just 3 days later, the governor could have appointed someone who could serve for a year until the next general election. But Arkansas law said that if it was anything over a year, they had to hold a special election. And so they decided that maybe the way to keep one of his political rivals from getting the seat and having the advantage of incumbency would be to appoint Senator Caraway's widow, Hattie. As it happened, that Congress, 2 of your representatives had died in office. And in both of those cases, their widows ran for their seats. Now, governors can't appoint anybody to the House of Representatives. It has to be a special election. In this case, they saw themselves as placeholders. Neither of them had any intention of running for office. And so they thought the same thing was going to happen with Hattie Caraway. In fact, so many of the early women U.S. senators were widows that an Arkansas political scientist, Diane Kincaid, once wrote an article about this, noting that the majority of women who served in the Congress before 1976 had been widows. The title of that article was "Over His Dead Body." Hattie Caraway was still in shock from her husband's unexpected death, but she accepted the appointment because she needed the salary. Her husband had left her with a lot of debts, so much so that their house in Maryland had to be auctioned off. And at least the senator's salary was one case where women got exactly the same salary that men did in those days. So she got her seat, and she got her nomination. The Democratic committee saw her as the Democratic candidate. In those days, being the Democratic candidate was tantamount to being elected. Her husband had won his last election with 82% of the vote. She would get 91% of the vote in the special election. So if all had gone as planned, Mrs. Caraway would have held the seat for just a few months and then stepped aside demurely to let a man be nominated for full term. But he hadn't counted on Hattie Caraway. She was fully aware of all the difficulties of being the only woman serving in what was essentially an old boy club. But she believed she was up to it. She noted in her diary that she had never tried to wear the pants at home when her husband lived, but she was now determined to fill his shoes. The Senate in those days worked on seniority, so if you're a freshman senator, you got assigned to a seat in the very back row, and that's where she was in 1931, when the Senate was almost evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats, and between those who wanted to use the government to help people get out of the Depression, and others who felt that the government would just add to the problems and wanted to keep the government out of all of this. The leader of the Senate in those days was a senator from Arkansas by the name of Joseph T. Robinson. The first oral history I ever conducted for the Senate was with Darrell St. Clair, who had come to the Senate staff in 1933 and who recalled Joe Robinson vividly as a tremendous, commanding person with a terrifying open-air voice. He could visibly shake the chamber when he wanted to. Everybody described him in physical terms along the way. He was a busy man, and he barely had time to acknowledge Hattie Caraway as a senator because he really didn't expect that she was going to be there for very long. Well, the very next senator to take his seat, a little late because he was governor of his state and didn't want to leave Louisiana, was Huey Long, the very flamboyant governor of the state, and he got the seat in the Senate chamber right next to Hattie Caraway. In those days, senators actually spent a lot of time sitting in their seats in the chamber. Before there was TV and other electronic ways of alerting them, the only way to know what was happening was to be in and around the Senate chamber. And so you sat through a lot of long speeches, and Hattie and Huey got to chatting in the back row. Hattie admired Huey Long because he had a bombastic rhetoric. It was not unlike her late husband Thaddeus Caraway's oratory. Although sometimes she found sitting next to Huey Long was a problem, he was so loud that he gave her headaches. Senator Long, in turn, appreciated her support for his populist approach to helping people through the Depression. So soon after he came to the Senate, the populist Huey Long began to aim his fire at Joe Robinson, his party's leader, accusing him of being far too friendly with big business. Robinson could barely abide Huey Long, and they frequently got into angry exchanges in the Senate chamber. Then, in May 1932, the day before the deadline for filing, Hattie Caraway decided to enter the contest for the Democratic nomination for the Senate. She said, "If I can hold on to my sense of humor and a modicum of dignity," she confided, "I shall have a wonderful time running for office, whether I get there or not." Senator Lincoln has told me that she carried that same quote along with her on her campaigns as well. Now, her seatmate, Huey Long, first tried to dissuade her that it was a mistake to run. But the more he thought about it, the more he thought, what a wonderful opportunity for him to inject himself into Arkansas politics and get under the skin of Joe Robinson. So, in 1932, the Arkansas primary became perhaps the single most memorable campaign in Senate history. Senator Caraway practically begged Huey Long to refrain from making personal attacks on her senior colleague, Senator Robinson. And she cautioned him not to expect that he would have her votes in his pocket. But otherwise, she gave him full run of taking over her campaign for a week, a mad week, throughout Arkansas. That campaign has been described as a circus hitched to a tornado. In 1 week, they made 37 speeches across the state, and they drew such large crowds that the events usually had to be moved into larger venues than planned. In one town, a trial adjourned so that the judge, the jury, the defendant, and all the courtroom spectators could come downstairs and hear Hattie and Huey. It was a murder trial. By the way, the defendant was acquitted. I think maybe everybody was in a good mood after hearing Huey Long at that point. But the publicity that he brought to this campaign was a great asset to a candidate who had almost no campaign funds of her own. Huey Long called Hattie Caraway the only representative you've got in the state who can be depended upon to vote for the rights of the common people. That was obviously a pointed assault at the state's other senator. Huey Long's biographer, T. Harry Williams, concluded that what Long did in that Arkansas campaign was to arouse to a full fury the resentment that farmers had been feeling during the Depression and to wield it into a, quote, genuine class protest. Where have we seen that recently? The 6 men who ran against Hattie Caraway in that primary included a former governor and a former senator. They made a formidable opposition, but she got more votes than all of those men put together. And in November 1932, she went on to serve a full term in the United States Senate. She became a loyal supporter of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, except on civil rights issues, where she voted the way all the other Southern senators did at the time. She became the first woman to chair a committee, the Committee on Enrolled Bills. She became the first woman to preside over the Senate. Now, reporters did call her Silent Hattie because she rarely spoke publicly, But she conducted herself with dignity, and she gained the respect from the rest of the members of the Senate at the time. It's often assumed that Hattie Caraway won her primary in 1932 solely because of Huey Long. And it is certain that the attention he brought to that campaign really gave her an advantage. What's often forgotten is that 6 years later, she ran again for re-election against another formidable candidate. And that was a young congressman by the name of John McClellan, who campaigned under the unsubtle slogan, "Arkansas needs another man in the Senate." At this point, Huey Long had died. He'd been assassinated in 1935, and she was running on her own. She did get a boost from President Roosevelt, who campaigned through Arkansas and who introduced Caraway to a crowd as a very, very old friend of mine and a friend of yours. She also built a reputation for answering her constituent mail and responding to people's problems, and she got strong support from women in Arkansas, even though there was still lingering prejudice against the idea of women in politics. So in 1938, Senator Caraway beat John McClellan in that primary. She got 51% of the vote and won the subsequent election. Hattie Caraway later tried for a third term in 1944, but by then the war was on, and the United States was fighting in Europe and Asia. International relations was not her strength, and she lost in that election to another famous Arkansas Senator, J. William Fulbright, whose sole term in the House of Representatives had already made him a renowned figure in foreign policy. She did feel disappointed, but she also felt relieved by the outcome. "Of course I was hurt by not getting more votes than I did," she wrote to friends, "but am glad I am out of the mess." So, Hattie Caraway's departure from the Senate did not see a large rush of women taking place. But in 1948, Maine elected a woman senator, also a widow, Margaret Chase Smith, whose husband had served in the House of Representatives. She won that. She served 24 years in the Senate, became highly influential. She was one of the very few senators to stand up against Joe McCarthy during the Red Scare, and she was the first woman in Congress to declare her candidacy for president in 1964. Senator Smith liked to say that she was elected as a senator, not a woman senator. But she was a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, clearly not a committee that dealt with women's issues for the most part, but there she championed the cause of the benefits of women in the service. And my colleague, Betty Cohen, who's now the Senate historian, said, literally, she was the first person on the Armed Services Committee to mention women. Margaret Chase Smith left office in 1973. And when I came to work in the Senate Historical Office in 1976, there were no women senators. By the 1980s, a pair of highly capable women served as senators. Nancy Caspar, Republican from Kansas, and Barbara Mikulski, a senator from Maryland. But there were never more than 2 women senators at a time. And then came 1992, known as the Year of the Woman. And what really changed things that year was the controversial nominations of Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court and the image of an all-male judiciary committee questioning Professor Anita Hill really angered a lot of members of Congress, women members of Congress. A lot of women in the House of Representatives decided to make the plunge and take the risk to leave safe seats in the House to run for Senate seats at that point. It also angered a lot of women voters who threw their support behind them, and in that election, 4 more women were elected to the Senate. Now, what was the most obvious change when suddenly we had, for the first time ever, 6 women senators? Well, it was actually architectural. Right behind the Senate chamber was a pair of louvered doors with a sign on it saying, "Senators Only." Rose Long, Huey Long's widow, had actually served in the Senate briefly to succeed him after he died. On her first day as a senator, she came out of the Senate chamber. She saw the sign, "Senators Only." She walked in and discovered she was in the men's room. Now, it's not that there was not a restroom for women. Upstairs on the 3rd floor, there was a room that was the ladies' retiring room that was for women's staff and spouses and senators. But that sign, "Senators Only," really rankled people. And in 1992, because of that election, they decided to divide that room into 2, so that there were 2 restrooms inside. Now, the men's room was twice as large as the women's room, but the architect figured there were a lot more men than there were women at the time. And Senator Patty Murray at the point in time said it was great to get this new room, but that she said the day will be even better when we have to enlarge it. And in fact, in 2013, that room was doubled in size. So another sign in those days was the Senate baths, which was a small pool and a steam room in the basement of the Russell Senate office building, which was installed there in 1909. The men could go in there and sweat, and soak, and swap stories, and coax each other for votes. But there was a long tradition of not wearing swim trunks in the Senate baths. So as a result, when women came to the Senate, they were not permitted to use the Senate baths. In 1981, Florida elected Paula Hutchison to the Senate. She had a bad back. So she petitioned the Rules Committee to let her use the baths, and they said, okay, you can use the Senate baths at dawn before the men get up. Well, she got in there, and she discovered that the only locker was an old file cabinet, and that the room was so disheveled that she couldn't imagine why anybody would want to use it at all at that point. But after 1992, when a large number of women were coming in, they went back to the Rules Committee, and then Chairman Senator Chuck Schumer agreed to authorize women's use of the facility. It's now a small gymnasium with exercise equipment that's used by both sexes. And it's still strictly senators only, so I've been assured that everybody dresses the same way today that they would if they were going to any other gym. And so the rules have changed a little bit along the way. Well, the ranks of women senators continued to grow, and in 1998, Arkansas sent a second woman to the Senate. Senator Blanche Lambert Lincoln. Unlike Hattie Caraway, Senator Lincoln did not succeed her husband in office. She had served on the House staff, and then she won election to the House, and then it was the same year that Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton was elected president, and 6 years later she became the youngest woman elected to the Senate, and during her 2 terms she rose to chair the Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry. Senator Lincoln was once asked about how she and the other women senators kept the men from patronizing them. She replied, "We as women, when we come to the table, we demand respect because we have done our homework. We are willing to fight the fight. I come to the table and I give them the statistics of my state and the people that I represent. I tell them what I want to do, how I want to do it, having done my homework. And it's hard for them to argue with me or to patronize me. I'm actually standing up for the people who have sent me." I have to say, it's been my personal observation that senators respect that kind of an attitude, and that all senators, regardless of their party or their state, while they speak on national issues, they represent their states, and they know everything there is to know about their states. You never really want to ask the senator about the specifics of what's going on in their state, because you have to be prepared to hear a lot of statistics at that point. Today, there are 21 women senators, and they represent a slightly higher percentage in the Senate, than the 85 women who served in the House. Paralleling them has been the increased number of women who served on the Senate staff. As late as the 1970s, when I joined the Senate Historical Office, a survey of women employment in the professions found that they made up only 27% of the highest paying positions and only 10% of the top positions in individual senators' offices. Even when women were holding the top positions on their committees, their average salaries remained lower than the men's, and the lowest paid man on the staff at that point, the title of chief clerk, was making more money than the highest paid woman at the time. The disparities were even greater for minority representatives. Lola Aiken, who had started out as Senator George Aiken's administrative assistant, then married the Senate, then gone back on his staff as an unsalaried administrative assistant. She blamed the low numbers of women on the staff to social prejudice. And she recalled, and she was quite indignant when she said this, that one senator had excused his hiring practice with the argument that, quote, "women don't have family responsibilities. They don't need the money." Today, women hold significant positions on the staff across the board. The Secretary of the Senate is the Chief Administrative Officer of the Senate, elected by the Senate to keep the Senate from falling apart when they're looking at other issues at the time, is a woman, and her 2 predecessors were women. She was my boss when I was the Secretary of the Senate. And what would really surprise Charlie Watkins of Arkansas, the parliamentarian today is a woman. Elizabeth McDonough is a skilled parliamentarian and absolutely political neutral. She's a little like an umpire at a baseball game. She calls them like she sees them, and therefore she's going to outrage about half of the stadium. I always enjoy talking to Elizabeth about the Senate rules, which she has described as so much powdered wiggery. She blames much of the current political politics on the commuting Congress that does not spend enough time in Washington. And Elizabeth actually grew up in Washington. She went to school with a lot of the children of members of Congress. She pointed out that it's very hard to attack someone that you had dinner with over the weekend. By the way, Elizabeth tells me that she gets a lot of calls, particularly from one C-SPAN watcher who calls, first off, to criticize what the women senators are wearing, and secondly, one day she called to claim that the woman who was presiding over the Senate was asleep. And Elizabeth looked up and said, no, she's texting under the desk. The notion, by the way, of appropriate dress for the Senate also comes in at this point. Until the 1980s, there was an unwritten rule that women only wore dresses, nothing else, no pantsuits or anything like that. And on a certain day, a certain Saturday, we know back in the days when senators actually came to the Senate on Saturdays, the men always dressed casually because they were going right to the golf course as soon as the session was over. But the women were supposed to dress as they did the rest of the week. So the women's staff, the ones who worked at the front, got together with the only two women senators at the time, Senator Mikulski and Senator Kaspar, and said if the senators would wear pants on one Saturday and all the women in the staff would wear pants, no one would object. And in fact, that's what they did. There were a lot of eyebrows raised, but not a single objection was raised. And since then, dressing on the floor has been up to the discretion of the individual senators, not to the unwritten rules. In recent years, the Senate has grown much more politically polarized. But women senators have gotten noticed for being more civil and more bipartisan. Reporters have observed that the women have appeared to have a, quote, an informal non-aggression pact. That attitude was reinforced by regular dinner meetings with the longest-serving woman senator, Barbara Mikulski, which often were held in her hideaway office at the Capitol. The rules of those dinners were no staff, no memos, no leaks, and no men. This was a bipartisan gathering. The participants sought to maintain a zone of civility that would help them transcend party lines and exert great influence on the Senate. Senior women senators began to provide orientation for the incoming women senators, and they could rely on each other for practical advice about things that they had in common, such as comparing notes on where to find childcare, what to do with children during the summers, and how to cope with the Senate's unpredictable schedules. When Senator Lincoln was leaving the Senate, she reminisced about a moon bounce, which she was not talking about anything dealing with NASA, but with her children's birthday that was going to take place very shortly after they came to Washington, before they really knew anyone. And so she basically contacted the other women senators, rounded up all the children she could to hold a party and have a moon bounce for the kids. And she said, what a difference that makes in your perspective on what you're doing here. In 2010, when the Senate was engaged in fierce political fighting, I attended a panel discussion on how women are changing the Senate. Senator Dianne Feinstein, a Democrat, started off the discussion by declaring that women senators were less partisan because, quote, we don't want to see each other fail. Senator Susan Collins, a Republican, asserted that if women were in leadership today, we would not see terrible partisan gridlock that we have. Senator Collins insisted that women were more collaborative, less focused on who gets the credit, more practical in their approach. Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison, another Republican, said that women had, quote, found a common bond on a thread of issues that have not been addressed because they related to women. And Senator Kristen Gillibrand, a Democrat, recalled that when she was looking for a Republican to co-sponsor her bills, you could always find an ally among the women members. As candidates, women always face the same obstacles. They're always being asked who is going to be taking care of their children if they got elected to office. And as senators, they had to ask the same types of questions, essentially, about what issues that affected women. They tended to operate under the assumption that senators from opposite parties who were willing to listen to each other would be more willing to compromise. And I think this is a huge issue that we as voters, to some degree, are responsible for electing people to office who have campaigned on promising never to compromise. And if you can't compromise, you can't legislate. As early as the 19th century with Senator Henry Clay, he used to maintain that all legislation is founded on the principle of mutual concession. And in more recent years, Wyoming Senator Alan Simpson said, if you are a legislator and you can't learn to compromise on an issue without compromising yourself, get out of the Senate. In fact, don't even get married either. You don't want any part of that. So in this respect, women senators have had a much better track record of reaching bipartisan agreement. So if the men and the voters would pay a little more attention, perhaps, to this style of governing, perhaps we could achieve greater consensus in tackling the nation's problems. Let me conclude by recounting another story that took place in the spring after the election. When newly elected senators arrived in Washington, feeling on top of the world from their victories at the polls, they encounter a bit of hazing from the Senate by being assigned to windowless offices in the basement of the office buildings, because seniority once again prevails. The incoming class of senators is not entitled to the more desirable offices vacated by the senators they replaced. Those offices are being repainted and new carpets are being installed so that the mid-level senators can move into them. Once the mid-level senators move out, then their offices are cleaned and recarpeted so that the freshmen can finally move upstairs out of the basement. Another Arkansas-related woman senator, Hillary Clinton, left the White House in the morning, where she was still living, motored up to the Capitol, and was ushered down into a windowless office in the basement of the Dirksen building. Everybody starts at the bottom in the Senate and these circumstances. And I once met with a group of Senate spouses to talk about this, among other things, traditions. And one of the questions that came up was, they'd been there for months, and their spouses were still down in the basement. When was this ever going to change? And I explained that, the election may be in November, and you may be sworn in January, but if you're lucky, it might be April or maybe May before you can move upstairs into a regular Senate office. And one of the spouses turned to me and said, well, the solution to this was simple. She said, they need to put a woman in charge. And I thank you very much for this opportunity.